My name is Adam Levitan, and the fantasy community is set to embark on a summer of zero intercourse, but a ton of best ball drafts across all sites, including our friends at DraftKings.com. On today's show, we're going to talk about the systemic differences between DraftKings and Underdog and how we can take advantage of them. Two big things about DraftKings for me. First, everybody needs to understand it is full PPR, whereas Underdog is half. And there are bonuses for 100 plus rush or receiving yards and 300 plus passing yards. And also, all of DraftKings best ball drafts are 20 rounds, whereas the drafts on Underdog are 18. So if we're just framing things macro, those are the two big things for me. I know those things don't sound like a huge deal, but they do make a really big difference. And so we're going to go through roughly 9 things to be aware of when you're playing on DraftKings that is different when playing on Underdog. I'm not sure Herzig and Leone agree with all these, by the way. These were mine. We'll talk about them. First, I think zero and hero RB on DraftKings is even more viable than it is on Underdog because it's just not as touchdown heavy. You get a point per reception. You get bonuses for yards. The best teams on DraftKings are scoring 180, 200 points in a week. And in this format, wide receivers and tight ends can separate a ton more. And so I am way more willing to start wide receiver, or start with one running back in the first 8 rounds or something like that on DraftKings than I am on Underdog. Herzig, do you agree there? And thoughts on hero and zero RB builds on DraftKings specifically?
Completely agree, though I think it's a little less than it used to be because we don't have those mid-late round running backs that can kind of piecemeal together as pass catchers that are benefiting more from the DraftKings scoring. Those just don't exist as much in today's game of football. So I think having those kind of elite or, legitimate workhorse running backs has become a bit more attractive in past years. But in general, yeah, I'd say almost like 40 to 50% of my teams end up being zero RB on DraftKings because the wide receivers just score so much more points. And those predominantly come from the first 2-3 rounds. Like if you look across projectable volume for the season, who actually does produce those results, I don't really want to be, missing out on those in the early rounds.
Yeah, we have a ton of data on DraftKings from the DFS streets, Leone, right? And this is the same format that we use for DraftKings DFS. We talk a ton about wide receiver versus running back in those streets. Obviously, in DFS last year also, you needed to be playing the elite running backs to have a good year in DFS. What do you think about how the scoring on DraftKings affects the running back position in hero/zero RB teams?
Yeah, it's difficult because the scoring system benefits the pass catchers. They're more likely to get the bonuses with the exception of a couple players. They're racking up the PPR points and they can really separate in a huge way. And quality at the receiver becomes more important than quantity at wide receiver. On Underdog, you can get away with quantity. Guy goes 2 for 50 with a touchdown. He cracks your lineup. Harder for that guy when he's competing with someone who's going 6 for 70 every week and he's still not outscoring him even with the touchdown or it's very close. So it definitely favors going wide receiver heavier, but the pricing in terms of ADP on DraftKings, the running backs go a little bit earlier and the wide receivers go later. So I do think it's definitely better to go zero and hero RB on DraftKings. You're getting better prices and the scoring system is better suited for it. And the 20 round format, quite frankly, is better for it as well in terms of being able to stockpile running back bets late. The only caveat I'll say, and why I think hero RB is pretty nice there, is if you are so different from the market, and our ranks on DraftKings can sometimes be so different than the market, you can't always take the wide receiver value. There's going to be good values, from rounds 1 through 13 showing. So you do have to think a little bit critically when okay, I've got a slightly better receiver value, but knowing my room just values wide receivers lower than me and running backs heavier, this might be a good spot to go against my ranks a little bit and lock up a running back that I do like when that sacrifice is small. You don't want to have to be forced into making that sacrifice when it's big later on and you've already filled up all your wide receiver spots.
Yeah, I know I've talked about this a ton on the solo pod. Just to reiterate again what Leone said, you're getting better prices on wide receivers on DraftKings, and it's a better scoring format for them. It's like, God, I felt like I had the nuts last year. Unfortunately, I did not. However, it certainly felt like that For sure. Okay. Second point to make about DraftKings, volume pass catchers are worth more in this format. So guys that come to mind at the top for me that are worth more on DraftKings, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jackson Smith and Jigba. And then, through the middle, guys like Jacoby Myers. At the end, guys like Wan'Dale Robinson. Those kind of wide receivers are worth more, where 7 catches for 50 yards, that's usable on DraftKings. On Underdog, it's just total dust. Like, you're not winning with 7 for 50 without a touchdown on Underdog. You need to score touchdowns, and the half PPR doesn't count as much. So obviously all that flows through to our rankings. Our inputs flow through to the rankings for guys like that. Herzig, anything to add on some of these wide receiver archetypes that are worth more on DraftKings?
Yeah, one mistake that I find myself even sometimes making, definitely seeing from others, is grabbing those Wan'Dale Robinson types later on in the draft when you already have a bunch of wide receivers and invested a lot of early capital on it. I like grabbing a Wan'Dale Robinson when I have I have 4 or 5 really early guys and I'm stopping at maybe 7 wide receivers, because then the Wan'Dale is really helping me just from a consistency to kind of piecemeal for when there's buys or an injury or such. If I'm going from a depth perspective on 8, 9 wide receivers, yeah, Wan'Dale might seem attractive when you're comparing to who he's being ranked against, but now I'm looking more for the upside. Maybe I only took 1 or 2 of the elite wide receivers early on, and now I want the profiles that actually have the season breakout archetype, which is rookies, which is new teams, which is players that maybe are, can maybe take that next jump. So that's where I'd say, like, I do like a Wan'Dale, but I want to make sure I'm also building my wide receivers for my wide receiver room.
Yep. Okay. I think that one is pretty self-explanatory. And yeah, like, playing these drafts at a really high level is at least thinking about what Herzig is saying. What type of wide receivers do you already have, and how does that fit with the rest of your room, instead of just blindly thinking about ranking? Let's go to the third point here. Hammer wide receivers on DraftKings. I mean, all my teams have 8 typically, often 9. We get 20 roster spots. Now, I think the base construction here, or at least the base construction for me, is 3 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 8 wide receiver, 3 tight end. I'm certainly willing to deviate from that, but that's like the base, and I would say how most roster constructions end out. That said, when I say hammer wide receiver, a lot of that just means I'm going to end up with 8, but I'm going to take 6 of them in the first 10 rounds or something like that. Herzig, anything else to add on roster construction here? How many wide receivers are you trying to end up with here on DraftKings?
Yeah, 3-6-8-3 makes sense. One thing I've started looking more at the past couple of years is, what is my roster construction looking like halfway through it? And there you can figure out from a balance standpoint. But for this, you see, hey, I'm definitely going to be heavy on the wide receivers. Lots of things we talked about, but I do think we want to be cognizant of not all 3-6-8-3s are the same. If you invest your last 2 rounds at one position, that's very different than 2 picks earlier on from a draft capital perspective.
I think, Leone, I kind of get trapped in this 3-6-8-3 because what happens is I feel like I need to get 6 running backs, because typically on DraftKings, my running back room is pretty weak. And I feel like I need to get 3 quarterback and 3 tight end, which we'll talk to in a second here. And that almost traps me into 3-6-8-3 on so many of my teams. Do you think that's a mistake, Leone, or anything to add on how many wide receivers you can end up with on DraftKings?
I do think, even though it's 20 rounds and you feel good about taking more wide receivers than running backs, that you might want to do some 7-7 builds if you're drafting these hero RB or zero RB teams, where you're really counting on, that's the advantage of taking the early wide receivers, is even on off weeks, they're going to count towards your score because the volume's so strong. Doesn't mean you don't want to take some shots on breakout wide receivers later, but I'd probably try and take more swings at getting lucky at running back and maybe go more of a 3-7-7-3 some of the time.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Fourth point on DraftKings is elite tight end fits better. Now, hopefully you listened to our discussion on the previous podcast about elite tight end on Underdog, which is a controversial topic. I think all 3 of us at this point, and I'm coming around to Bowers and McBride, are going a little high for me on Underdog, and they're going a little bit later on DraftKings, and they fit a little bit better the format here. Herzig, why do you think elite tight end is better on DraftKings?
Yeah, and I mean, we look at specifically at the players too. You've got Trey McBride, you've got Brock Bowers. Even when we get into the specifics of these players, these are players who actually aren't going to score that many touchdowns. Trey McBride, we had didn't score a touchdown for the first, 15 games or something, and they had to keep force feeding it. And then you got Brock Bowers, the Raiders. You've got Ashton Genty. You've got, they're just not going to score as much. These are players who, even their archetype is to fit better for DraftKings. Then throw on the whole macro from DraftKings of, hey, PPR, these are target hogs. These have high target shares. They're actually going to be able to separate just from receptions away from the rest of the field, unlike an underdog. Then you have the bonuses. There are not many tight ends who actually have access to 100-yard games, but Trey McBride and Brock Bowers are those. And so when you throw all this together, and we can talk about the 20-round aspect, because in the 19th, 20th round, we still have tight ends that are starting tight ends available in those extra 2 rounds, grabbing someone like a Brock Bowers or Trey McBride, and then using your 19th and 20th to grab 2 more tight ends that have either a Tyler Higbee safety or a Terrence Ferguson upside. It makes sense.
Yeah. Leone, anything to add here on elite tight end on DraftKings? We get a lot of these games from guys like McBride that are like 11 catches for 80 yards, which is an absolute smash on DraftKings, not as strong on underdog. And obviously if they get the bonus, the yardage bonus, it's a turbo smash. Leone, anything to add here on elite tight end?
Yeah, I mean, Herzig hit the nail on the head. I think the ability to take 3 tight ends might seem counter to taking an elite tight end, but Herzig's point there is you have the extra roster spots and you're getting starting guys late and very cheap. So you're kind of getting the safety that you don't get on underdog. If you go elite tight end, you're getting that safety while still getting the upside, and the upside matters more. The top 2 tight ends this year, we have ranked below ADP on underdog because the market seems to really value having an elite tight end there. But the scoring system and the way those guys work, we actually have them ahead of ADP on DraftKings. So it's not like we're in or out on these players like in a vacuum, but it definitely makes sense on DraftKings. I'm looking at our projections in terms of number of catches. And once you get past the top 10 tight ends, Bowers and McBride are projected to catch like 50 more balls than most of these guys. That's an extra, 25 points. In addition to the 25 or the half PPR you would get, that's like 4 touchdowns more on DraftKings than on underdog. And that doesn't even count the bonus aspect.
Well, this is the
yardage bonus.
Right. And this is the argument that people make for elite tight end. It's that these guys can separate, right? So like they can separate so far from the rest of the guys and outscore the field. There was that year Travis Kelce outscored every other tight end by like 100 points or something completely insane. Leone, what do you think about that argument for elite tight end where it's, hey, especially on DraftKings where it's full PPR and there's bonuses, these guys can separate massively compared to other positions?
Yeah, you definitely see more ability to separate when they do hit. You also see more ability for them to not kill your lineup when they don't hit, which I think's important relative to underdog.
Okay. 5th point for me on DraftKings is rushing quarterbacks are less valuable, pocket passers a bit more valuable. So just in a vacuum in the scoring system, rushing touchdowns are not worth as much relatively on DraftKings as they are on underdog. You can make up for it, the lack of rushing touchdowns, with 300-yard days, getting the bonus there. Sam Darnold last year was a great example. Goff. For this year, Stroud, Trevor Lawrence, Dak Prescott, some of my favorites, in terms of those like 3 pocket passer builds. I'm very willing to go to war with 3 guys from those, from that tier, especially if they're stacked. So I don't find myself taking Lamar, Hurts, Allen as much, Daniels as much on DraftKings as I do on underdog. Herzig, any thoughts on this whole idea of rushing quarterbacks being worth less on DraftKings?
Yeah, I mean, we love the elite QBs because of that rushing aspect, but on this site, it's just not as impactful. It doesn't help you separate from the other QBs. And when we think about like, hey, that 20-round bonus for the QBs, for tight ends, for QBs, you actually can't get starting QBs in the 19th, 20th rounds. If you start looking at drafts right now, and maybe when, we have more confidence in Shuck or Rodgers or something as starters, but the last starting QBs are often going in like the 15th, 16th round. So you don't have that ability to say, hey, let me grab an elite and then 2 later on. Instead, you want to grab 3 in that more balanced perspective, similar to what we talked about on the previous podcast. Hey, maybe in that 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th round, grab those. The other aspect is from an elite, like, but hey, Lamar and Jaden can get 100 rushing yards. They get the bonus. On average, they might get it around once per the season. I think Lamar hasn't done it nearly as much as we think. He gets a lot in that 80 range. So I don't want to account for that rushing as having more access to that bonus as we do with running backs.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's go to point 6. And I mentioned this a little bit. I'm almost always taking 3 quarterbacks and 3 tight ends on DraftKings. I think on Underdog, we talked about 2 tight end builds, 3 tight end builds, even 4 tight end builds. On DraftKings, on Underdog, we talked about 2 quarterbacks or 3 quarterbacks. On DraftKings, I find so many of my teams to be 3 quarterbacks and 3 tight ends. Herzig, how often on DraftKings are you deviating from 3 quarterback and 3 tight end builds?
I would say rarely ever do I have less than 3 tight ends. So it's almost always 3 with occasionally getting 4. Again, you have those 2 extra rounds where you can find another starting tight end. So if I don't like my tight end room, grabbing 4 late, I'm perfectly content with. On the QB side, I almost always love to be looking for 3 QBs. But I will say in the drafts I've done this year, if I have taken an elite, you have to be careful, as I kind of mentioned, because these starting QBs, they do fall off a little quicker than we'd expect. So I'm still trying to get 3, but that also is another reason why I don't want to devote the elite capital and then have to spend 2 more mid-round picks on quarterback to end up with 3 QBs. I'd rather just go with those 3 mid or late QBs.
Yeah, Leone, anything to add here on roster construction? I know we can do some unique things, but with 20 roster spots, it's hard for me. I feel like I'm behind if I don't have 3 quarterbacks and 3 tight ends, I guess is my point.
Yeah, I think especially at tight end with the injury rates being a little bit higher, you probably always want 3, and they are a lot of the times later just safer picks. When you get into those late teen rounds, you get actual starting tight ends versus guys that may be 4th, 5th on the depth chart in terms of the running back, wide receiver position.
All right. Number 7 is the relative lack of rookie thirst on DraftKings. I mean, these freaks on Underdog are out of control with the rookies. It is very hard to get a value on a rookie. And by the way, Silva's first top 150 is up, and a lot of the guys he's behind on versus Underdog ADP are rookies. And I kind of agree with him that it's just completely out of control. Now, when you're doing rankings for season long, it is far different than doing rankings for best ball, of course. But I guess to bring it back to DraftKings, Herzig, there is not nearly as much of this. I have to get rookies. Rookies are awesome. We're going to draft rookies way higher than maybe they should go on median or base projection than they do on DraftKings, where you can get really good values on rookies later. I had a ton of Brian Thomas last year. I had a ton of Xavier Worthy. I had a ton of Rome Odunze. All those guys last year were very, very affordable on DraftKings compared to Underdog. Herzig, how do you play this on Underdog where rookies are more accessible?
Yeah, I mean, if you're drafting off ETR ranks, you're just going to see them at the top of your queue a ton. And for me, I'm mostly just like, you know what? I'm going to take it. I'm going to eat into it. And so now you want to make sure that with your build, you don't have all rookie wide receivers where you're going to struggle in the early part as they maybe take a little time to get their footing. But for the most part, let me lean into it. Let me just, hey, I'm building for the playoffs. I'm building for when these players are going to be peaking, and give me the value where I can get it.
Leone, noted rookie freak, back-weighted production is something we talk about a lot for best ball. I mean, the way it played out for Xavier Worthy last year was the way that it was a little bit too late for a lot of my teams, but it's kind of the way that you hope that it goes for a rookie where you get a lot of that production late in the year. Do you think on DraftKings people just aren't factoring that in enough, or do you think on Underdog they've gone too far in the terms of rookie thirst?
I mean, probably in the middle. And again, while there's an opportunity on both sides in different directions based on what the market overvalues or undervalues, I do think you want to at least be somewhat tethered to the market. When we did the Underdog pod, I talked about in 3 tight end builds, maybe reaching on Tyler Warren to get that archetype into your room, because it's harder to get the rookie upside, knowing you can take some volume tight ends later. On DraftKings, it might be the opposite. As Herzig said, you might see rookie wide receivers at the top of your queue for 3-4 rounds in a row. Overall, I want to get exposure to those guys. It was more good than bad the previous few seasons if you did that. But I did also admittedly have some teams where I probably went too far, had 4 rookies, got the one big breakout, but then had too many holes in my roster. So that's where you might want to at least somewhat monitor your exposures, diversify, and say I'm going to take, maybe Mike Evans isn't a good example, but like at that 3-4 turn, maybe I'll take DJ Moore over Tet McMillan once in a while, just so I don't end up with 4 rookie wide receivers. I want some of that projectable volume in my room to start and just kind of have a balanced receiver room. So just kind of keep that in mind while you're drafting. Definitely lean into it, like Herzig said, but you can do so and still kind of be aware of breaking tiebreakers in order to have a collective wide receiver room that gives you what you want.
That example of Tet versus DJ Moore reminds me that I need to be using the draft assistant tool when I'm drafting, just so it shows me, because last year there were so many spots where I was so overconfident in the player take where I was like, oh, yeah, of course I'm taking this guy, and end up with like not that exact decision, but 80% of one guy and 5% of the other guy in the spot that I hit so many times, and like I just want to be more balanced there.
Is this the Marshawn Lloyd factor from last year?
That was early on. Thankfully, I got off Marshawn Lloyd once it started to go bad for him, but yes, that's a good example. All right, 2 more to get to here. Point 8, stacking is less important on DraftKings than it is on Underdog. This might be a little bit counterintuitive because you would think, hey, you start to rack up a lot of points when your wide receiver or tight end starts to catch a lot of balls from your quarterback. Herzig, why stacking less important on DraftKings than Underdog?
Yeah, so start with a baseline on Underdog. We understand half PPR, so the points that you score are primarily coming from the touchdowns. That's where it's a larger percentage of your total points is touchdowns. And when QBs throw for touchdowns, wide receivers catch touchdowns, they're highly correlated there. That's how you get the big outcomes. On DraftKings, wide receivers can have huge games just by getting a ton of receptions. You have that 10 reception, 80-yard game that you talked about for the tight end earlier. For the tight end, that's 18 points. For the quarterback, that's only 3.2 points or whatever, because they're only getting the passing yards there. So you can, you can take wide receivers. They're going to have big games. They can put up 20, 25 points, maybe even to get the bonus. That's another 3 there that don't impact the QB. And so the correlation is just a lot stronger when it's a touchdown dependent site like Underdog than it is with the bonuses and the PPR on DraftKings.
Yeah, and I still think you want to be stacking as much as you can on DraftKings, because it's like, let's say you want to make a bet on Raiders offense just as a whole. Well, Gino's going to have a good year. If in order for that outcome to hit, Gino's going to have a good year. So I still want to be stacking. But Leone, what do you think about this idea that stacking is not as big of a priority on DraftKings?
It's not something I hadn't really thought of before, but I think Herzig's right. I mean, he's just mathematically right in terms of how the scores add up and it being less important than an Underdog. 2 things here. With those high volume wide receivers early being less correlated with their quarterback because they're so volume driven, I do think like sometimes people, when they have to make a stack decision, like, they've got Jalen Waddle and they've got Puka Nacua, they think I should go Stafford because I need Puka to do a good year. I drafted him early. I think it's more the opposite. Like, give me Waddle, the efficiency play. He's the guy that could jump. If Tua has a huge year, could jump a bunch in value. Puka is somewhat, obviously he needs Stafford to stay healthy, but assuming he does, what Stafford gives you or doesn't probably isn't going to super sway Puka's year because he's so volume driven. So that's one thing. The other thing, I think people sometimes undervalue what it is just to get like a 3rd quarterback score that like just doesn't sink you on a given week. I actually had a team on FFPC a few years ago where I like auto drafted an unstacked 3rd quarterback at one point during my slow draft. And then lo and behold, first week of the playoffs where you got to go week 15, 16, 17, that score gets into my lineup, absolutely saves me. Now that's just one anecdote. Everybody has anecdotes one way or the other, but I do think that situation probably would come up more than people realize. Where like, I just got a really good value on a quarterback. He's going to give me a few very good scores. I don't absolutely have to have taken an earlier pass catcher to be able to take, a falling CJ Stroud when his price is so low. And I know I'm taking 3 quarterbacks because of the 20 rounds.
Yeah. Would you guys take a pocket passer unstacked late? Like, man, I don't have any Texans or I don't have any Jaguars and I don't see any backdoor stacks. And those are bad examples because there are backdoor stacks with those teams, but I don't see any backdoor stacks. I don't have any front door stacks, but I kind of like this quarterback and I kind of need quarterback. Can I just take him naked? Can I just like take a Geno naked with no other Raiders? Herzig, do you think that's okay?
I wouldn't reach for it. But
Yeah.
if from a draft capital standpoint, I need another quarterback, I've got this good ADP value of a quarterback, I'm not going to nay it just because I don't have any stacks there.
Yeah. All right.
Agreed.
Okay. Last point to make here on DraftKings is be aware of questionable tags. So DraftKings will put a Q tag on a guy, and sometimes they're just ridiculous. Like they're not even, guys are perfectly fine. They're not questionable at all, but there'll be a Q tag on them, and that will affect ADP. Now, of course, if you're uploading our rankings and if you're looking at my player by player notes for anyone that DraftKings might have a Q tag on, I have a note of how we're projecting them, how we think, if we think they're actually going to miss games or anything like that. But we see this over and over again, Herzig, where, I mean, if you're doing drafts, especially lower dollar stuff, people are going to be affected by the Q tag. Underdog does not show Q tags in their draft applet.
Yeah, and it affects ADP because the more drafts that are done, even across like all price points, people are just a little more weary when you're going between two players and you see a Q next to one and you're not in the weeds, as much as we are, and you're like, is there something I don't know? People are going to go the other way, and so we do see that impact ADP as we get closer to the season. Injuries pop up, like those injuries, maybe we actually want to, take into consideration. Maybe last year we didn't account for those enough. But right now in May, because Kenneth Walker has a Q, because literally no reason, maybe something happened like last year, that shouldn't bother us. So let's lean into that, take advantage of it, trust your ranks, trust your knowledge of the players.
For sure, yeah. And like I said, you can consult with the player-by-player notes. But yeah, if a guy like misses OTAs right now because his wife is pregnant or something, DraftKings will put a Q tag next to his name. I mean, it's crazy. But yeah, anything else to add on that or anything else DraftKings specific before we get out of here?
I would just lean on our rankings in those cases. If there's something legitimately worried to be about, we've probably taken it into account. Like Herzig said, maybe there were some situations last year we could have been more conservative. So you do want to have a feel for the injuries and understand that there's always going to be a little bit more uncertainty. But we're not going to have a guy ranked, 30th overall if there's a legitimate chance he's going to miss, half the season or something like that. So don't be afraid to take advantage of those values.
Yeah, and also on injuries, like there's stuff out there about Chris Godwin, about Rashee Rice, about some other guys. The easiest time to replace fantasy points is early in the season. So if you told me Chris Godwin was going to miss week 1, week 2, week 3, there's no bye weeks, my team isn't hurt yet, I'm totally fine with that. It's when they start to miss more than that where obviously you run into problems, but I don't want to overreact to someone who might miss week 1, week 2, week 3 in best ball. It's just not that big of a factor whatsoever. All right. That is going to do it for our look at how to beat best ball on DraftKings.com. If you have not yet subscribed to our YouTube, it is indeed completely free. We will continue to have best ball and fantasy football content all summer. If you do hit the subscribe button, you will be notified by the people at YouTube when we put out a new video, so be sure to do that. For Herzig, for Leone, producer Ryan, producer Luke, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.